The escape pod hit the planet's surface with enough force to crack 2 of Jake Harrison's ribs and shatter the navigation console into 1,000 glittering fragments. For a long moment, he simply sat there in the smoking wreckage, breathing shallowly through the pain, listening to the alien wilderness beyond the hull. The Kryllian crew had made their decision 3 hours ago. The human is a liability, Captain Vexnor had announced, his chitinous mandibles clicking with satisfaction. Our contract was for mining labor, not for dead weight that questions our methods. Jake had questioned more than their methods. He'd reported their illegal strip mining operation to the Galactic Council, documented their violations of protected ecosystem protocols, even tried to stop them from drilling into what the orbital scans clearly showed was a breeding ground for the planet's native megafauna. The Kryllians didn't appreciate whistleblowers, so they drugged his ration pack, stuffed him into the oldest escape pod on the ship, and launched him toward Vex 7, a planet so hostile to sentient life that the Galactic Council had marked it as a Level 9 hazard zone. No rescue missions, no emergency beacons, just predators, toxic flora, and a 93% mortality rate for any unlucky soul who crashed here. The Kryllians had given him a death sentence and called it an unfortunate accident. Jake forced himself to stand, wincing as his ribs screamed in protest. The pod's medical kit was basic but functional. He injected himself with a pain suppressor and bone-knitting agent, knowing he had maybe 48 hours before the compound wore off. After that, he'd be healing the slow way, assuming he survived that long. Through the cracked viewport, he could see the planet's surface. A dense jungle of bioluminescent vegetation that pulsed with sickly green light, massive tree analogues that stretched hundreds of meters into the perpetually overcast sky, and in the distance, the silhouettes of things too large to be anything but predators. The pod's automated systems had already assessed his situation. No edible food stored, water recycler damaged beyond repair, communications array completely fried. The cheerful AI voice informed him that his odds of survival were approximately 0.003%, then wished him a pleasant day before shutting down permanently. Jake laughed. A single bitter bark of sound that echoed in the ruined pod. Earth's survival training had covered wilderness scenarios, but that was Earth wilderness. Not alien hellscapes where every single thing wanted to eat, poison, or dissolve you. He salvaged what he could. A carbon fiber blade, a half-functional scanner, a thermal blanket, and a single emergency flare. Not much to stake a life on. As he stepped out of the pod and into the humid alien air, something roared in the distance. A sound so deep and powerful that he felt it in his chest cavity. A bone-rattling declaration of dominance that made every prey instinct in his body scream at him to hide. More roars answered it, coming from multiple directions. The jungle around him erupted with movement as smaller creatures fled in terror. Jake Harrison stood alone on Vex 7, abandoned by those he'd trusted, surrounded by apex predators, with no hope of rescue. He checked his scanner, adjusted his grip on the knife, and started walking. The Kryllians had forgotten one crucial thing about humans. Earth hadn't handed them the top of the food chain. They'd clawed their way there, one species at a time, turning wolves into dogs, wildcats into companions, prey animals into livestock. Humanity had a special talent, refined over 10,000 years of evolution. They made friends with things that wanted to eat them. Vex 7 was about to learn what that meant. The creature had been following Jake for 3 hours before he decided to acknowledge it. At first, he'd only caught glimpses. A shadow moving parallel to his path through the bioluminescent undergrowth. The occasional rustle of vegetation that didn't match the wind patterns, twin points of reflected light that tracked his movement through a clearing. The scanner identified it as a mid-tier predator, roughly 50 kilograms, quadrupedal, carnivorous. Jake kept walking, but his mind was racing through everything he knew about animal behavior. Predators that stalked prey this long were either extremely cautious or extremely curious. The cautious ones would have attacked by now or moved on. Curiosity was something he could work with. He stopped in a small clearing where a fallen tree analog had created a gap in the canopy. The perpetual twilight of Vex 7 was slightly brighter here, the bioluminescent fungi casting everything in shades of blue and green. Jake sat down on the log, making himself smaller, less threatening. Then he waited. The creature emerged after 5 minutes. It was beautiful in a lethal sort of way, low-slung and powerful, with 6 legs ending in retractable claws, a sleek body covered in iridescent scales that shifted color with its mood, and a wedge-shaped head dominated by intelligent amber eyes. Its mouth was full of serrated teeth designed for tearing flesh, and a row of flexible spines ran down its back, currently flattened against its body in a neutral position. Jake had seen cats do the same thing when they were uncertain. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his voice low and non-threatening. "You've been following me for a while, trying to figure out if I'm food or something else." The creature's head tilted, processing the sound. Its spines rippled, not raised in aggression, but moving in what almost looked like curiosity. Took 3 steps closer, then stopped, testing his reaction. Jake didn't move. He'd learned years ago that the first rule of dealing with predators was simple. Don't act like prey. Prey ran. Prey panicked. Prey made themselves victims. But he also couldn't act like a competing predator. That would just trigger a dominance challenge he was in no shape to fight. So he acted like what he was. Something new. Something interesting. Something that didn't fit into the creature's predator-prey paradigm. He reached slowly into his salvage supplies and pulled out a protein bar from the pod's emergency rations. Not ideal, it was meant for human consumption and might be toxic to alien biology, but he had nothing else to offer. He broke off a piece and tossed it gently to land a few meters from the creature. The predator flinched back, spines half-raising, then crept forward to sniff the offering. Its forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air around the protein bar. After a moment's consideration, it picked up the morsel in its jaws and retreated to a safe distance to consume it. Jake watched the creature's body language carefully. If it showed signs of distress, he'd know the food was harmful. But its spines relaxed, and it swallowed without difficulty. For the next hour, Jake sat on that log and engaged in the oldest game humanity had ever played, earning trust. He tossed another piece of food, closer this time. The creature approached with less hesitation. He talked to it in a low, constant stream of words. The meaning didn't matter, just the tone, the rhythm, the indication that he was a thinking being offering non-aggressive contact. By the time the alien sun had moved noticeably across the sky, the creature was sitting 3 meters away, watching him with what he could only describe as fascination. "You're smarter than you look, aren't you?" Jake said, breaking off another piece of protein bar. This time, instead of tossing it, he held it out in his open palm. The creature stared at his hand for a long moment. This was the crucial point, the moment where it would either accept the strange new relationship or decide he was being too presumptuous and remove his arm at the shoulder. It stood, took 2 slow steps forward, and delicately plucked the food from his palm with its teeth, careful not to break skin. Jake felt something crack open in his chest. Not quite hope, but its first cousin. On Earth, his people had done this with wolves thousands of years ago. They'd found common ground with creatures that could have torn them apart, and they'd built something stronger than fear. "All right," he said to the creature, who was now watching him with clear intelligence in those amber eyes. "If we're going to be friends, you need a name. How about Shimmer? For the way your scales change color." Shimmer's spines rippled in what Jake chose to interpret as approval. As night fell on Vex 7, a night even darker than the perpetual twilight, when the apex predators emerged to hunt, Jake didn't sleep alone in the ruins of his escape pod. Shimmer curled up near the entrance, those amber eyes reflecting the glow of his emergency light, watching the darkness beyond. A predator guarding instead of hunting. The first alliance had been forged. The howls started at midnight. Jake jerked awake, his hand instinctively going to his knife, as a chorus of sounds echoed through the jungle, deep, resonant calls that spoke of pack coordination and organized hunting. Shimmer was already on her feet. He decided she was female based purely on instinct. Her spines fully raised, her scales shifting to a dark, mottled pattern that screamed threat display. The scanner identified them before he saw them. 6 large signatures, each massing roughly 150 kilograms, moving with coordinated precision through the undergrowth. Apex predators, pack hunters. The first one emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given flesh. It stood on 4 powerful legs, each ending in claws the length of Jake's forearm. Its body was heavily muscled, built for explosive speed and sustained pursuit, covered in thick, armored plates that overlapped like natural chainmail. The head was massive, dominated by a jaw that could clearly crush bone, with 3 sets of forward-facing eyes that marked it as a dedicated predator. A crest of bone and horn crowned its skull, probably used for establishing pack hierarchy through ritual combat. The creature's pack mates emerged behind it. 5 more nightmares, slightly smaller than the alpha, but no less deadly. They spread out in a classic hunting formation, cutting off escape routes, preparing to overwhelm their prey through superior numbers and coordination. Jake realized with crystal clarity that he was about to die. Then Shimmer did something that surprised him. She didn't run, didn't cower. Instead, she moved to stand between Jake and the pack, her body language shifting into something he recognized from watching wolf documentaries back on Earth. A subordinate asking permission to approach a more dominant predator. The alpha's multiple eyes focused on Shimmer, processing this unexpected behavior. This pack held position, waiting for a command. Jake's mind raced. Pack hunters meant social structure. Social structure meant communication, hierarchy, rules beyond simple predation. These weren't mindless killing machines. They were organized, intelligent, capable of complex decision-making. In other words, they were exactly like the wolves his ancestors had encountered 30,000 years ago. He stood slowly, making himself visible but keeping his posture neutral, not submissive but not challenging. The alpha's gaze shifted to him, and he saw its eyes narrow, calculating. It had probably never seen anything like him before. To this creature, he was an unknown variable, something that didn't fit into any existing category. Jake did the craziest thing he'd done since arriving on Vex 7. He stepped forward, past Shimmer, and addressed the alpha directly. "I know you can't understand me," he said, his voice steady despite his hammering heart. "But I'm not your prey, and I'm not your competition. I'm something else entirely." He reached into his salvage supplies and pulled out his last 2 protein bars. Not enough to feed a pack of apex predators, but enough to make a statement. He unwrapped them both and tossed them to land in front of the alpha. The pack tensed, interpreting the sudden movement as a potential attack, but the alpha's low rumble kept them in check. The creature approached the offerings cautiously, sniffed them, then consumed both in quick succession. Jake watched for any sign of distress, but the alpha seemed unaffected. Good, whatever Earth-based proteins were in those bars, they apparently translated across biology. "I don't have much," Jake continued, "but what I have I'll share. That's the deal. You don't eat me, I don't try to kill you, and maybe we figure out if there's something mutually beneficial here." The alpha stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then it did something that made Jake's breath catch. It lowered its massive head and released a sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't aggressive either. It was questioning, curious. Over the next 3 weeks, Jake learned the rules of pack dynamics firsthand. The alpha, he named him Titan for obvious reasons, was cautious but not hostile. The pack returned each day, initially just watching from the shadows, then gradually coming closer as Jake proved he wasn't a threat. He established himself as something the pack had never encountered. A provider who wasn't prey, a presence who offered resources without competing for them. He couldn't hunt the way they could, but he had other skills. His knife and knowledge of basic traps allowed him to catch smaller creatures that the pack normally wouldn't bother with, not worth their energy for the small amount of meat. But when Jake caught 6 of them and made a small pile as an offering, the pack's younger members were allowed to feed first, taking the bounty without having to expend their own energy. Jake was inadvertently teaching them that his presence meant surplus resources. He learned their body language, the subtle shifts in posture that indicated hierarchy shifts, the vocalizations that meant different things, the way they coordinated hunts through what seemed like a combination of sound and bioluminescent flashes from specialized organs under their armor plates. Shimmer integrated into the pack not as a full member, but as something associated with Jake, a bridge species, tolerated because she was clearly under his protection. The pack seemed to view him as some sort of strange, hairless alpha of his own peculiar pack of one. By the end of the 3rd week, Jake was sleeping surrounded by 6 apex predators who could have torn him apart in seconds, but instead treated him as something between a packmate and a curiosity worth preserving. He'd made friends with the top of Vex 7's food chain. But there was still one problem. Food was running out and the pack was getting hungry. The breakthrough came when Jake followed the pack on a hunt. Titan had initially been reluctant to allow him to join. The Alpha's body language had been clear about that. But Jake had persisted, following at a distance, proving he could keep up despite his comparative fragility. Eventually, Titan had stopped trying to drive him back, accepting his presence with what seemed like resigned tolerance. The hunt itself was a masterclass in coordinated predation. The pack moved through the jungle like a single organism, communicating through low-frequency rumbles that Jake felt rather than heard, flanking a herd of massive herbivores that resembled 6-legged buffalo covered in rocky, crystalline armor. But what caught Jake's attention wasn't the pack's hunting technique. It was the herbivores themselves. They were massive, easily 2 tons each, with those crystalline formations covering their bodies in geometric patterns. But they were also docile, relying on their armor and herd behavior for protection rather than aggression. When the pack struck, taking down a juvenile separated from the herd, the rest simply reformed their defensive circle and waited for the danger to pass. Prey animals. Social prey animals with defensive behavior rather than flight response. Jake's mind started working through the implications. That night, instead of accepting his share of the kill from the pack, he made a proposal through actions rather than words. He gathered the flexible, strong vines that grew throughout the jungle and began weaving them into a crude rope. Shimmer watched with her characteristic curiosity, head tilted, while Titan observed from a distance with those calculating eyes. It took Jake 3 days to build the enclosure. It wasn't much, just a circular fence made from young tree analogues lashed together with woven vines, barely strong enough to contain the herbivores. But it was enough for a demonstration. Using the pack to help drive a small group of 5 herbivores, he'd started calling them rockbacks in his head. He managed to herd them into the enclosure. The pack had been confused at first, watching as Jake closed the primitive gate and stood back. Titan had approached the fence multiple times, clearly wondering why Jake had trapped good food and wasn't allowing them to feed. Jake had held his ground, physically placing himself between Titan and the gate. "Not yet," he'd said firmly. "Trust me." The standoff had lasted for hours. The pack had grown agitated, hungry, confused by the strange behavior from the weird hairless creature they'd been tolerating. But Jake had maintained his position, using every bit of body language knowledge he'd accumulated to communicate a simple message. Wait. Finally, Titan had backed down, though his rumbling displeasure had been clear. Over the next week, Jake demonstrated something revolutionary for Vex 7 farming. He kept the rockbacks enclosed but alive, feeding them the abundant vegetation from around the camp. The herbivores, once they realized they weren't being immediately killed and eaten, had settled into a nervous but stable routine. They had food, water, and relative safety from predation. And they were producing something valuable, the juveniles. Rockbacks, Jake had observed, bred quickly. One of the females had given birth just days after capture. The juvenile was small, vulnerable, and exactly the kind of easy meal that would have required significant energy for the pack to hunt down normally. Jake had waited until the juvenile was weaned, then opened the gate and allowed the pack to take it. The look in Titan's eyes after that meal had been something close to understanding. Jake spent the following days expanding his agricultural experiment. He built a second enclosure and caught 2 more rockbacks. He showed the pack that by maintaining a breeding population, they would have access to regular, easy meals without the energy expenditure and danger of hunting fully grown adults in the wild. The pack's behavior began to shift. They stopped hunting rockbacks outside the enclosures entirely, instinctively understanding that those were wild stock that could potentially be added to the farm. Young pack members who had previously been learning hunting techniques through experience were now learning to help Jake with herding, driving wild rockbacks toward the enclosures rather than killing them. Shimmer took to the new arrangement with enthusiasm, seemingly understanding her role as a bridge between Jake's strange ideas and the pack's predatory instincts. She helped maintain the perimeter, keeping other predators away from the enclosures, and even seemed to enjoy the challenge of herding. But the most remarkable change was in Titan himself. The massive alpha had begun to seek out Jake's company, not as a subordinate approaching a superior, but as something approaching partnership. When Jake was building a third enclosure, Titan had dragged over a fallen tree analog without being asked, dropping it near the construction site. When smaller predators approached the camp, Titan's pack drove them off, protecting not just their own territory but Jake's projects. One evening, as the bioluminescent jungle pulsed with its eerie light, Jake sat outside his reinforced shelter, no longer the crashed escape pod, but a structure he'd built with salvaged materials and local resources. Shimmer dozed at his feet. The pack was arranged around the clearing in a defensive perimeter, with Titan lying just a few meters away, those multiple eyes half closed but always aware. Jake looked at what he'd accomplished in just a month. 3 species of Vex 7's predators, domesticated not through force or subjugation, but through mutual benefit and understanding. Shimmer, the curious scout predator who had become his first ally. Titan and his pack, the apex predators who had learned that cooperation with this strange alien brought more benefits than competition. And the rockbacks, who had traded their freedom for safety and regular feeding. He'd recreated 10,000 years of human agricultural development in 30 days. The Kryllians had left him here to die. They'd assumed Vex 7 would consume him like it consumed everything else that was unlucky enough to crash here. They'd forgotten that humans didn't just survive hostile environments. They transformed them. The rescue ship arrived on day 32, and it wasn't who Jake expected. The Galactic Council had finally processed his report on the Kryllian mining operation. When the ship had returned to port without him, claiming an unfortunate accident, the Council had launched an investigation. The escape pod's black box had transmitted just enough data before dying to give them coordinates. They'd come expecting to recover a body. Instead, they found a thriving homestead. Commander Thes-6, a 4-armed Kryllian with deep purple skin and compound eyes, stood at the edge of Jake's clearing with her mouth hanging open, an expression that looked particularly dramatic given her species' facial structure. "What?" she said slowly. "In the name of every known deity, is this?" Jake stood in the center of his compound, Shimmer at his left side, Titan's massive bulk at his right, with 4 more pack members visible in the shadows and 3 enclosures full of rockbacks behind him. He was tanned from Vex 7's strange sunlight, leaner than when he'd arrived, with scars on his arms from a dozen close calls. But he was alive. More than alive. He was thriving. "This," Jake said with a grin, "is what humans do." The council delegation spent 6 hours documenting everything. They recorded Shimmer's obvious bond with Jake, following him like an oversized cat and accepting physical affection that would have been suicidal for anyone else. They watched in stunned silence as Jake hand-fed Titan scraps of meat, the massive predator accepting the offerings with gentle precision. They observed the pack's protective behavior around the enclosures, understanding without being told that these herbivores were not to be hunted. "This planet was rated as a level 9 hazard," Thes-6 said, reviewing her datapad with disbelief. "The mortality rate for stranded individuals is 93%, usually within the first 72 hours. You've been here for over a month. You've somehow befriended apex predators. You've established agricultural practices. You've created a functional ecosystem around yourself." Jake shrugged. "My ancestors did the same thing on Earth. It's kind of our specialty." "The Kryllians are facing charges for attempted murder," Thes-6 continued. "Your testimony, combined with the evidence you gathered before they marooned you, has resulted in the complete shutdown of their operation. Captain Vexnor is claiming you somehow survived through impossible circumstances and that your survival proves his actions weren't actually dangerous." "Let me guess," Jake said dryly. "He wants the charges reduced? The council would like you to return to testify. Your presence would significantly strengthen the case." Thes-6 paused, looking around at the clearing, at the predators who watched her team with wary but non-aggressive eyes, at the impossible little settlement Jake had carved from one of the most hostile environments in the sector. "But I suspect you're not eager to leave." Jake looked at Shimmer, who chirped softly and pressed against his leg. He looked at Titan, the massive alpha who had learned to trust the strange, soft creature with the clever hands and stranger ideas. He looked at the enclosures, at the beginnings of something that could grow into a real farm, maybe even a permanent settlement. "I'll testify," Jake said finally. "The Kryllians need to face justice. But after that," he trailed off, gesturing at the compound. "I'd like to come back. There's work to do here." Thessex's compound eyes whirred as they focused on him. "You want to return to a level 9 hazard planet voluntarily?" "I want to return home," Jake corrected. "Vex 7 tried to kill me, yeah. But it also showed me something important. Humans don't need to be at the top of someone else's food chain. We just need to understand how food chains work and find our place in them. These predators aren't monsters. They're intelligent, social creatures who are just trying to survive. The rockbacks aren't livestock. They're partners in a system that benefits everyone." He scratched Shimmer behind her head ridge, and she made a sound like a purr crossed with a rumble. "Besides, someone needs to make sure this place doesn't stay a level 9 hazard forever. With proper understanding and management, Vex 7 could be transformed. It's already happening." The council delegation left 3 days later, taking Jake with them but also taking extensive documentation of his techniques, his behavioral observations, and his theories about potential colonization strategies for high-hazard worlds. The trial took 4 weeks. Captain Vexnor and his crew were convicted, their corporate licenses revoked, and substantial reparations awarded to Jake for his suffering and illegal imprisonment. But the most significant outcome wasn't the verdict. It was the attention. Jake Harrison's story spread through the Galactic Council like wildfire. The human who had been abandoned to die on a level 9 hazard world and had instead domesticated 3 species in 30 days became something of a legend. Earth's reputation shifted almost overnight. Humans were no longer seen as just clever tool users or decent problem solvers. They were recognized for what they truly were. A species that had spent their entire evolutionary history turning hostile environments into homes, turning predators into partners, and finding ways to not just survive but thrive in situations that would destroy most other races. Jake returned to Vex 7 6 months later, not as a castaway, but as the head of the Vex 7 Development Initiative. He brought supplies, equipment, and volunteers, both human and alien, who wanted to learn his techniques. Shimmer greeted him at the landing site, bigger now, fully mature, with a mate and 3 juveniles who watched the strange soft creature with inherited curiosity. Titan emerged from the jungle with his pack, now 8 strong, moving with the confident stride of predators who had learned that cooperation brought more benefits than competition. The rockback enclosures had been maintained by automated systems during his absence, and the population had tripled. As Jake stood in his clearing once more, watching the bioluminescent jungle pulse with alien life, he thought about the Kryllians who had tried to kill him, about the verdict that had vindicated him, about the awards and recognition that had followed. None of it mattered as much as this. The feeling of Shimmer's head under his hand, the rumble of Titan's greeting, the peaceful sounds of rockbacks grazing in their enclosures. The Kryllians had abandoned him here to die. Instead, he'd found something far more valuable than revenge or recognition. He'd found proof that the human talent for domestication, for finding friendship in the strangest places, for transforming hostility into harmony, that talent wasn't limited to Earth. It was universal, and Vex 7 was just the beginning.